Hello again. Yesterday I talked a little about folklore and about Odin and so on. Somebody in one of the comments mentioned the Kurgan Hypothesis for the origin of the Indo-Europeans. And I'm currently writing a book. I've been commissioned to write a book about folklore, and it won't be published until the end of next year. But a lot of this concerns the Kurgan Hypothesis and how some of the real life events of the odyssey of the Indo-European tribes who moved into Europe might form the basis for a lot of our myth system and fairy tales. So what I thought I would do was read out the opening chapter of this book, which I've completed. It's liable to last quite a while, and for those that find somebody reading out from a book boring, I would recommend that you switch over channels now and find a kitten peering out of a boot or a puppy on a roller skate or something. Anyway, this is chapter 1 of the book on folklore, and it's called The Magical Realm. We live in the most technologically advanced society ever known, full of wonders which would have been unimaginable only a generation ago. Every bit of our world has been mapped, catalogued and photographed. From our mobile telephones or laptops, it is possible to summon up satellite pictures of any part of the Earth's surface and to zoom in and see what every city, forest, desert and plain looks like. With the GPS facility on our phones, being lost or out of touch with other people is unheard of for most of us in our day-to-day lives. There are, of course, great advantages to this lifestyle, but there is too a downside, a price to be paid. This lies in the loss of wonder, the realisation that the world is no longer a mysterious place and that no hiding place is left for anything much out of the ordinary, whether it is a Loch Ness monster or lost valley of Shangri-La in the Himalayas. If these things existed, then we would spot them on Google Earth or on some webcam or other. This goes some way toward explaining the attraction of an alternative world which is still largely unmapped and where one might stumble across the most amazing people and places, even go where no man or woman has ever before set foot. Unknown creatures dwell there, as well as races other than humans. The strange thing is not that so many of us have a vague desire for such an alluring and magical land, which seems so much more attractive than our own. It is that the features of these imaginary worlds almost invariably conform to the same parameters. In other words, we do not all dream up completely individual fantasies of this kind, but tend to use a broadly similar template or pattern. When we read fantasy fiction, watch a television series or film, or play a computer game, we subconsciously judge these against a common framework. The film version of The Lord of the Rings was so successful for this very reason, that it resembled closely the magical world which is part of our heritage. The television series Game of Thrones was set in a similar universe of wizards, dragons and warriors. Fiction of this kind strikes a chord in those of European heritage, and it sometimes seems that we are unthinkingly comparing narratives like these with a template which we have never fully articulated to ourselves. A more recent example of this appeal of the lost world may be found in the Disney film Maleficent, and the features of this landscape may be traced from the Arthurian legends through to Grimm's fairy tales and then on to the world of the Lion, the Witch and the Wardrobe. Let us pause for a moment and consider what this imaginary country for which we feel such a wistful longing is like. The first thing we observe is that this is a pre-industrial society. Technology has not advanced beyond the spinning wheel and blacksmith's forge. Machinery is wholly unknown. At the very latest, we might be looking at the medieval period, but it is altogether possible it is centuries or even millennia earlier than this. The land is largely untamed, with vast primeval forests and moors haunted by bears, wolves, and other even stranger creatures such as dragons or men who can change at will into ferocious beasts. There are no cities, merely villages surrounded by cultivated fields. Here and there are strongholds and castles of local chieftains and warlords, some of whom style themselves princes or even kings. These leaders range from wise and kind to capricious and cruel. The laws of nature in this universe are precisely the same as in our own. Those living there must eat, and therefore grow crops, keep sheep and cattle, as well as hunting wild animals such as boar. The force of gravity is roughly the same. Night alternates with day, and men and women have a natural lifespan. They grow old and die, or can be killed in wars. This is not some land of wish fulfillment where everybody is happy or immortal. Some people are rich and others poor. There are beggars and princes. In between these two extremes are the mass of ordinary people, the farmers, craftsmen and their families. In addition to these ordinary human inhabitants, there are various other individuals who are possessed of strange powers. These are the wizards and witches. Wizards are usually solitary beings, often wanderers with no permanent home. They very often carry staffs, wands or sceptres, long stick-like objects endowed with special power. Witches tend to be a little more gregarious. One would not expect to find 3 or 4 wizards working together, but half a dozen witches might very well cooperate to cast some especially powerful spell. Cauldrons are sometimes used for the conjuring up of spells and enchantments. The society which lives in this strange world is divided into 3 different classes or castes, an important point to which we shall return in greater detail at a later stage. These are wizards or priests, the 2 categories are sometimes interchangeable, warriors, and ordinary farmers and workers. Although on rare occasions a member of the labouring classes might aspire to or even achieve the ambition of becoming a warrior or wizard, the reverse never happens. The idea of a knight or wandering man of magic working for a living like anybody else is unthinkable. This is not, of course, as has already been remarked, some place of wish fulfilment. Still less is it any sort of paradise. There is misery, sickness and poverty, and the lives of men and women are strictly limited. Nor is it the land of eternal youth or any other form of mystical afterworld. People grow old and die, misfortunes befall them, they are hungry and thirsty, life can be hard, with no promise of reward. If you wanted to dream up a fantasy world where everybody is happy and content, and all our troubles melt away, this is not what you would come up with. Life here is as arduous, disappointing and hazardous as it is here in the real world. It is important to realise this. If you were setting out to invent a heaven where we would all live happily ever after, this would not be the sort of scenario you would devise. It was remarked above that the physical world imposes the same constraints upon those living in what might be termed the magic realm as in this world, but under certain circumstances these may be evaded or overthrown. In our world, of course, we can defy gravity or prolong life by means of machinery based on scientific principles. Spaceships, jet aircraft and heart transplants, to give a few examples. In this other world, the laws of nature can be bent by the use of magic. If anybody wishes to travel through the air, it might be done not by going to an airport, but rather by means of dragons, flying carpets or broomsticks. The humans often seem to share their world with other races, each of which have their own distinctive characteristics. In mines and caves live the small dark dwarves who are often surly and overly fond of gold. Then there are the fays or fairies, beings who live in the woodland and are seldom glimpsed by the humans. We have described above what might be described as fairy tale land. It is a setting for most traditional stories like Beauty and the Beast, Snow White, and all the rest that we remember from childhood. It is also where the hobbits live, and one would not be at all surprised to bump into Gandalf there, or Merlin, King Arthur, or for that matter the cast of Game of Thrones. All of them would be quite at home in the land we have just looked at, which, when you think about it, is more than a little odd. To those listed above, who would not be out of place, we can add all the characters from C.S. Lewis's Narnia books, many of those from Terry Pratchett's Discworld novels, the cast of Wagner's Ring Cycle, and the men and women from the Middle English classic Sir Gawain and the Green Knight. So powerful is the attraction of this imaginary landscape, and so universal the themes and characters found within it, the heroic warrior on a quest, the solitary wizard, the little people and so on, that it seems likely that the whole thing, stage and actors both, has a common origin. This cannot lie in the literature of the past, for already the earliest written versions of this world are clearly based upon one original. The Icelandic Eddas, Malory's Morte d'Arthur, the fairy tales of Beauty and the Beast, none of these can be the source of the original images. All draw, though, from that source, which undoubtedly lies in the pre-literate past. Having sketched out the topography and some of the inhabitants of the world of fantasy and fairy tales as we know it today, I want to talk a little about a broadly similar landscape which actually did exist, and see if there might be a connection between the two. Having done so, we can make a comparison between the two places and see if one might have been the inspiration for the other. Picture, if you will, a space roughly the size of a continent, corresponding as a matter of interest to the dimensions of Middle-earth in the maps drawn by Tolkien's son Christopher for the first edition of The Lord of the Rings. In the north of this huge territory are frozen wastes, and, just as in our own world, the further south one travels, the warmer it becomes. For this reason, those living here regard the right hand as wholesome and good, and the left-hand path as bad and undesirable. This is because they orient themselves not by facing north, but east. The right-hand way then leads to warmer and more pleasant climes, and the left to the inhospitable wastelands in the north. There are no cities in the largely unexplored and wild plains, forests and mountains, merely small villages and a scattering of farmsteads. In that respect, it might perhaps be compared to the American West of the mid-19th century. The parallel is a pleasing and appropriate one, for those living here are not the indigenous inhabitants. They came originally from the east, which is why they face towards their homeland when they orient themselves for direction. Here and there are forts and castles, some of which are ruled over by men who view themselves as kings. In modern society, there are strict delineations between the real world and the spiritual, between the living and the dead, between fact and fiction. No such distinction exists here. Some rivers and lakes are inhabited by local deities who must be placated in case they snatch children and drag them under the water to drown. The dead can be a menace as well, because they do not automatically leave the world of the living after their hearts stop beating. Some of them linger on and return, cause misfortune to those still living. They too must be treated with respect and propitiated. Gods sometimes adopt human form and walk the earth. Offending such a one can bring ruin upon a family. Luckily, there are men and women who can help people to keep on the right side of the angry and vengeful dead, and know too how to keep both the elder gods and the minor deities happy, so that they will look favourably upon the farms and cause the crops to grow in due season. The men who undertake these religious and magical duties are wizards, and they can be distinguished by the tall pointed hats which they wear, as well as by the wands or staffs which they carry with them. They interpret the will of the gods, and sometimes predict the future by various methods of divination. They also explain which sacrifices must be made to ensure that the earth continues to yield a good harvest, and that enemies are kept at bay. One example of the sort of sacrifice which is regularly advised has a familiar ring to it. In the story of King Arthur, as it has come down to us, he is the possessor of an important sword called Excalibur. As he lies wounded and at the point of death, he orders his companion to take Excalibur and hurl it into a nearby lake. When this is done, a woman's arm rises up from the water and catches the hilt of the sword before brandishing it 3 times and then sinking back into the lake with it. It has been caught by the mysterious Lady of the Lake, either an enchantress or perhaps a primeval deity of the water. The story of the Lady of the Lake and the sword thrown into the water for her is a well-known one, but strikes us today as bizarre in the extreme. Why ever would anybody throw a perfectly good sword, especially a famous one like this, into a lake? It makes no sense in the real world. For those living in the world at which we are now looking, it made perfect sense to be ready and willing to give up a precious object in this way if it meant keeping gods, wizards and witches on your side. They often sacrificed weaponry in this way by depositing it in rivers and lakes. Their swords, shields and helmets were very important to them, luxury items which would today be the equivalent of a new sports car. But if it meant showing gratitude for victory in a battle or a plentiful harvest, then they did not hesitate. Some pools near their villages were clogged up with dozens of swords. Rites like this, when people would gather to give up something which was very precious and important to them, were key to understanding this society. It was a hazardous and uncertain land where dangers lurked at every turn. Those perils came in many forms, and it was not always easy to recognise the true nature of either animals or men or women. Outside the villages and on the edge of civilised and tamed farmland live wolves, bears and large cats. Even these are not always what they seem. Some of these ferocious beasts are really men who have used magic to transform themselves into animals. Such men might farm their fields by day and then turn into wolves at night, especially during a full moon. One can never be sure of strangers either. An old beggar woman might turn out to be a beautiful enchantress in disguise. An old man walking the roads might be the king of the gods, visiting the earth to see how his subjects are behaving. For this reason it is wise to be hospitable to lone travellers and give alms to beggars. Those who neglect these duties have sometimes been cursed by a witch or been punished by the gods. At night, when the work was done, the villagers would listen to stories and the retelling of legends. Sometimes they would tell each other tales of long ago. But the wizards who visited them were also professional bards, and they would relate poems and stories to entertain their hosts. Some of these are still known to us today. Beauty and the Beast was one of them, and the idea of a fairy causing a man to be changed into a hideous animal caused no raised eyebrows, for all those listening had heard of similar cases. Rumpelstiltskin was also a favourite because there too one of the little people played a central role. Stories about the good folk or hidden people struck a chord with those in this world because they were as much a real and present danger as the wolves which sometimes carried away lambs from their flocks. Sometimes babies would be stolen away by the fairies, or they might raid an orchard and take all the apples from the trees. Tools and farm implements might be stolen at night. Younger people believed the little people to be supernatural beings, but some of the older villagers remembered that they themselves were relative newcomers to the land, and that they had driven out the original inhabitants, killing most of them. A remnant lingered on though, eking out a wretched existence in forests and caves, conducting low-key guerrilla operations against the invaders by kidnapping their children and engaging in acts of minor terrorism. The two worlds at which we have looked in this chapter are so similar as to be all but indistinguishable. It takes no great leap of faith to believe that one is derived from the other. The second of the two descriptions given above is of Bronze Age Europe, and although a little imagination and colour has been added and a few shrewd guesses made to fill in one or two blanks, the facts are presented pretty much as most recent work in archaeology and genetics suggest. Of course, the question we must next address is the extent to which it is reasonable to believe that most of us have in our minds an image of European life in the Bronze Age some 4,000 years ago, and that this exerts a powerful influence upon our choice of television programme or the computer games which we play. This sounds on the face of it a little fanciful. The next chapter will deal with the way in which memories may be passed down by word of mouth for hundreds, perhaps thousands of years. The story of Excalibur and the Lady of the Lake is a good instance of this. The practice of Bronze Age weapons being consigned to rivers and lakes ended at or before the Roman occupation of Britain. The first written account of Arthur's sword being deposited in a lake in the same way may be found over 1,000 years later. Assuming that it is not mere coincidence, which seems unlikely for such a peculiar incident, and that it was indeed based upon the sacrifice of swords and other war gear to spirits and fairies of the water, then stories of this practice must have been passed down from generation to generation and kept alive purely by word of mouth. There are other and better attested cases of this phenomenon, and we shall now examine them. And that is the end of the opening chapter of the Book of Folklore, which, as I say, won't be published until the end of next year at the earliest. I'm currently writing 3 or 4 books simultaneously, as usual. Anyway, it'll be back to usual tomorrow. I just thought it might interest people that were, found what I had to say yesterday of some interest on this subject.